Old man's hat is knocked off by bikers, then they face his son. In the heart of a vibrant city known for its resilient spirit, a ruthless biker gang ruled the streets through intimidation and reckless behavior. Led by the feared Razor, the gang's presence alone was enough to make people step aside, their hearts pounding with trepidation. The gang thrived on chaos, believing themselves untouchable, above the law and the common decency that held society together. On a sunny afternoon, Mr. Ellis, a well-respected elderly man known for his kindness and wisdom, walked along the sidewalk, his steps slow but purposeful. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the roar of motorcycles approaching until it was too late. A group of bikers sped past him, and one of them, a young man with a sneer on his face, reached out and intentionally slapped Mr. Ellis's hat off his head. The bikers laughed as they rode away, their raucous amusement echoing off the buildings. Mr. Ellis stood still, his hat lying on the ground beside him. The onlookers remained silent, their eyes averted, unwilling to confront the gang. They knew the price of standing up to Razor and his crew. But what the bikers didn't realize was that Mr. Ellis was the father of Daniel Ellis, a man with a reputation of his own, one built on discipline, honor, and an unwavering sense of justice. As Mr. Ellis picked up his hat and dusted it off, he couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness wash over him. Not for himself, but for the young men who had lost their way, who believed that fear and intimidation were the paths to power. He knew that his son, Daniel, would not let this disrespect go unanswered. And while he didn't condone violence, he understood that sometimes, a stand had to be taken. The city was about to witness a clash between two very different kinds of strength. Daniel Ellis sat in his office, reviewing paperwork for the community center he ran, when his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and saw it was his mother. With a smile, he answered, but the smile quickly faded as he listened to her recount the events that had transpired with his father and the biker gang. A former Special Forces soldier, Daniel had seen his share of conflict and had learned the true meaning of courage and honor. After leaving the military, he had returned to his hometown, determined to make a difference. He had earned the respect of the community through his tireless work and unwavering dedication to making the city a better place for everyone. As he listened to his mother's voice, a slow burn of anger began to build inside him. He had always known about Razor's gang, but he had hoped that they would keep their chaos contained to their own circle. Now, they had crossed a line by targeting his father, a man who embodied the very best of what their city stood for. Daniel thanked his mother for letting him know and assured her that he would handle the situation. He leaned back in his chair, his mind already racing with plans. He knew he couldn't just confront the gang head-on, that would only lead to more violence and chaos. No, he needed to be strategic, to find a way to dismantle their power from the inside out. He thought of the community center, of the programs he had put in place to give young people a sense of purpose and belonging. Maybe that was the key. If he could reach out to the younger members of the gang, show them a different path, he could begin to chip away at Razor's influence. Daniel stood up, his resolve hardening. He would not let his father's humiliation go unanswered. But he would respond with the tools he knew best: compassion, understanding, and an unyielding belief in the potential for change. As news of the incident spread throughout the city, the tension began to build. For years, the residents had lived under the shadow of Razor's gang, too afraid to speak out against their reckless behavior. But now, with Daniel Ellis involved, there was a palpable shift in the air. People began to whisper, to share stories of Daniel's bravery and his dedication to the community. Razor, sitting in his dimly lit hideout, heard the rumors and scoffed. He had dealt with do-gooders before, and they had all backed down in the face of his power. He couldn't imagine that Daniel would be any different. But as the days passed and the whispers grew louder, Razor began to feel an unfamiliar sensation: unease. Meanwhile, Daniel was hard at work, reaching out to the younger members of the gang. He invited them to the community center, offering them a safe space to talk and learn. At first, they were hesitant, suspicious of his motives. But as they spent time with him, they began to see a different side of life, one where they were valued for their potential, not just their ability to cause fear. One young man, Carlos, had been with the gang for years, drawn in by the promise of power and respect. But as he listened to Daniel talk about honor and purpose, He began to question his choices. He had never known a life outside of the gang, but now, he could see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Back at the hideout, Razor paced the floor, his anger growing with each passing day. He had heard about Daniel's efforts to reach out to his gang members, and he saw it as a direct threat to his authority. He knew he needed to act soon, to remind the city who was really in charge. The stage was set for a confrontation, but the outcome was far from certain. Would Daniel's message of hope and change prevail, or would Razor's reign of fear continue unchallenged? As Daniel continued his work with the young gang members, he knew he was walking a fine line. He was well aware of the danger he was putting himself in by challenging Razor's authority, but he also knew that he couldn't stand by and watch as the city suffered under the gang's rule. One evening, as Daniel was locking up the community center, he heard the roar of motorcycles in the distance. He tensed, knowing that Razor and his crew were likely on their way to confront him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Moments later, the motorcycles screeched to a halt outside the center. Razor dismounted, flanked by his most loyal followers. He strode towards Daniel, his eyes flashing with anger. "You think you can just waltz in here and take my crew away from me?" Razor snarled, his voice dripping with menace. Daniel stood his ground, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not trying to take anyone away from you, Razor. I'm just offering them a different path, one where they don't have to live in fear and violence." Razor laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You don't get it, do you? Fear and violence are the only things that matter in this world. And I'm the one who controls them." Daniel shook his head. "You're wrong, Razor. There's more to life than that. These young men have the potential to be so much more than just thugs and criminals." Razor's face twisted with rage. He took a step forward, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt. But before he could make a move, Carlos stepped out from behind Daniel. "He's right, Razor," Carlos said, his voice trembling but determined. "I don't want to live like this anymore. I want something better." Razor stared at Carlos, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out. But instead, he turned on his heel and stalked back to his motorcycle. "This isn't over," he growled, before speeding off into the night. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He knew that this was just the beginning, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that change was possible. In the days that followed, Daniel's influence continued to grow. More and more of the younger gang members began to attend his community center, drawn by the promise of a better life. They learned new skills, found mentors who believed in them, and began to see a future for themselves beyond the confines of the gang. Razor, however, was not about to let his power slip away so easily. He began to tighten his grip on the remaining members of the gang, using fear and intimidation to keep them in line. He also started to spread rumors about Daniel, trying to undermine his reputation in the community. But Daniel refused to be deterred. He knew that he was making a difference, and he was determined to see it through. He reached out to other community leaders, building a network of support and resources for the young men who were trying to leave the gang life behind. One of these leaders was Maria, a fiery woman who ran a local shelter for at-risk youth. She had seen firsthand the damage that Razor's gang had done to the community, and she was eager to help Daniel in his efforts. Together, Daniel and Maria worked tirelessly to provide opportunities for the former gang members. They helped them find jobs, enroll in school, and rebuild their lives. And as they did, something remarkable began to happen. The community, which had once been so afraid of Razor and his gang, began to rally around Daniel and his cause. People started to speak out against the gang's activities, refusing to be intimidated any longer. They organized neighborhood watch groups, cleaned up graffiti, and took back their streets. Razor watched all of this with growing frustration and anger. He knew that he was losing control, but he refused to admit defeat. He began to plot his revenge, determined to make Daniel pay for his interference. But even as the tension mounted, Daniel remained focused on his mission. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that he had the strength and support of his community behind him. As the weeks passed, Daniel and Maria's efforts began to bear fruit. More and more of the former gang members were finding their footing, building new lives for themselves and their families. The community center was buzzing with activity, filled with young men and women who were learning, growing, and discovering their own potential. But even as they celebrated these victories, Daniel knew that they couldn't let their guard down. Razor was still out there, and he was not about to give up his power without a fight. One evening, as Daniel was walking home from the community center, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting to see one of the young men from the center. Instead, he found himself face to face with Razor. The gang leader's eyes were cold and hard, filled with a hatred that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "You think you've won, don't you?" Razor sneered. "You think you can just take my crew away from me and get away with it?" Daniel stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not trying to take anyone away from you, Razor. I'm just giving them a choice, a chance to build a better life for themselves." Razor laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "A better life? There's no such thing. The only life that matters is the one where you have power, where people fear you." Daniel shook his head. "That's where you're wrong, Razor. Real power doesn't come from fear. It comes from respect, from the knowledge that you're doing something good in the world." Razor's face twisted with rage. He reached for his knife, but before he could draw it, a voice rang out from behind him. "Drop it, Razor." Daniel looked past the gang leader to see Carlos, standing tall and proud, a determined look on his face. Behind him were a dozen other former gang members, all of them ready to stand with Daniel. Razor looked from Daniel to Carlos and back again, realization dawning on his face. He had lost, and he knew it. With a snarl of frustration, he turned and stalked away, his remaining followers trailing behind him. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to Carlos, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Carlos nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We've got your back, Daniel. Always." With Razor's power weakened and his gang members defecting in droves, Daniel and his supporters knew that they had to strike while the iron was hot. They began to organize community meetings, inviting everyone from local business owners to concerned parents to come together and discuss ways to make their city a safer, more vibrant place. At first, attendance was sparse. People were still wary, afraid of retaliation from Razor and his remaining followers. But as word spread about the positive changes taking place, more and more people began to show up. They talked about everything from improving the local schools to creating job training programs for at-risk youth. They brainstormed ideas for community gardens, art projects, and neighborhood watch groups. And as they did, something remarkable began to happen. People who had once been strangers began to see each other as allies, as friends. They shared stories, laughter, and tears. They discovered common ground and forged new bonds. And as they worked together towards a common goal, they began to feel a sense of pride and ownership in their community that they had never experienced before. Daniel watched all of this with a sense of awe and humility. He had always believed in the power of community, but to see it unfolding before his eyes was something truly special. But even as they made progress, Daniel knew that they couldn't let their guard down. Razor was still out there, and he was undoubtedly plotting his revenge. One night, as Daniel was locking up the community center, he heard a noise behind him. He turned, expecting to see one of the volunteers. Instead, he found himself face to face with one of Razor's remaining lieutenants. The man's face was hard and angry, his eyes glinting with malice. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" he snarled. "You think you can just turn our own people against us and get away with it?" Daniel stood his ground, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not turning anyone against you," he said. "I'm just showing them that there's another way, a better way." The lieutenant's hand twitched towards his waistband, and Daniel tensed, preparing for a fight. But before either of them could make a move, a voice rang out from the darkness. "Leave him alone." Daniel turned to see Carlos emerging from the shadows, flanked by a group of other former gang members. They stood tall and proud, their eyes filled with determination. The lieutenant looked from Daniel to Carlos and back again, his face twisting with rage. But he knew he was outnumbered. With a snarl of frustration, he turned and slunk away into the night. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to Carlos, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks," he said softly. Carlos nodded, his eyes gleaming with pride. "We're in this together, Daniel. We won't let Razor win." As the community continued to unite and grow stronger, Razor found himself increasingly isolated. His once loyal followers were abandoning him in droves, drawn by the promise of a better life that Daniel and his supporters were offering. Desperate to maintain his grip on power, Razor decided to take drastic action. He gathered his remaining gang members and hatched a plan to strike at the heart of Daniel's efforts, the community center. Late one night, they made their move. They crept through the darkened streets, their faces hidden beneath bandanas and hoodies. When they reached the community center, they quickly overwhelmed the lone security guard and forced their way inside. Once inside, they began to systematically destroy everything they could find. They smashed computers, tore down bulletin boards, and poured paint over the carefully crafted murals that adorned the walls. They were determined to send a message, that they were still in control, and that anyone who challenged them would pay the price. But even as they wreaked havoc, they failed to notice the silent alarm that had been triggered the moment they broke in. Within minutes, the police had surrounded the building, their sirens echoing through the empty streets. Razor and his gang found themselves trapped, with nowhere to run. They had underestimated Daniel and his supporters, and now they were paying the price. As the police led them away in handcuffs, Daniel and his team arrived on the scene. They surveyed the damage with heavy hearts, knowing that it would take time and effort to rebuild what had been lost. But even in that moment of darkness, there was a glimmer of hope. The community rallied around them, offering their support and resources. Local businesses pledged to help with the repairs, while volunteers came forward to clean up the mess. In the face of adversity, the community had come together once again. They had shown that they were stronger than Razor and his gang, and that they would not be intimidated into submission. As the sun began to rise over the city, Daniel stood amidst the wreckage of the community center, his eyes filled with determination. "We will rebuild," he said softly, his voice carrying across the crowd. "And we will come back stronger than ever." In the weeks that followed the attack on the community center, Daniel and his team worked tirelessly to rebuild and restore what had been lost. It was a daunting task, but they were not alone. The entire community came together to support them, donating time, money, and resources. As the repairs progressed, something remarkable began to happen. People who had once been content to sit on the sidelines began to step forward, offering their skills and expertise. Electricians rewired damaged outlets, plumbers fixed broken pipes, and artists repainted the colorful murals that had once adorned the walls. Even some of Razor's former gang members joined in the effort, seeking to make amends for their past mistakes. They worked side by side with the very people they had once sought to intimidate, learning valuable skills and forging new friendships in the process. Through it all, Daniel remained a constant presence, offering encouragement and guidance wherever it was needed. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he also knew that they had the strength and resilience to overcome any obstacle. As the community center began to take shape once again, Daniel couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. Just a few short months ago, the city had been gripped by fear and despair, held hostage by Razor and his gang. But now, there was a new sense of hope and possibility in the air. People were starting to believe in themselves and each other again. They were starting to see that they had the power to create positive change, to build a better future for themselves and their children. And at the heart of it all was the community center, a beacon of light in a world that had once seemed so dark. It was a place where people could come together, regardless of their background or circumstances, and find the support and resources they needed to thrive. As Daniel looked around at the smiling faces and bustling activity, he felt a sense of pride and gratitude well up inside him. They had come so far, and there was still so much more to do. But he knew that together, they could achieve anything they set their minds to. As the community center reopened its doors, it quickly became clear that something fundamental had shifted in the city. People who had once been afraid to leave their homes after dark were now out and about, enjoying the parks and public spaces that had once been Razor's domain. Local businesses were thriving, as residents felt more confident about spending their money in the community. New shops and restaurants were opening up, bringing fresh energy and vitality to the streets. But perhaps the most significant change was in the young people of the city. Many of those who had once been drawn to Razor's gang were now finding a new sense of purpose and belonging at the community center. They were learning valuable skills, exploring new interests, and forming positive relationships with mentors and peers. Daniel watched all of this with a sense of pride and satisfaction. He knew that there was still much work to be done, but he could see the seeds of change taking root all around him. One evening, as he was locking up the community center, he heard a familiar voice behind him. He turned to see Carlos, the young man who had once been one of Razor's most loyal followers. "Hey, Daniel," Carlos said, his voice soft and hesitant. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, Carlos. You did this. You made the choice to walk away from Razor and build a better life for yourself." Carlos shook his head, his eyes glistening with tears. "I couldn't have done it without you, man. You showed me that there was another way. You gave me hope." Daniel reached out and clasped Carlos's shoulder, his voice firm and sincere. "You always had hope, Carlos. It was inside you all along. All I did was help you find it." As he watched Carlos walk away, a new spring in his step, Daniel felt a sense of renewed determination wash over him. There were still challenges ahead, but he knew that together, they could overcome anything. Months passed, and the city continued to thrive under the guidance of Daniel and the community center. Razor and his gang had become a distant memory, a cautionary tale of what could happen when fear and intimidation were allowed to run rampant. But even as they celebrated their victories, Daniel knew that they could not become complacent. He had seen firsthand how quickly things could change, how easily progress could be undone by those who sought to exploit fear and division for their own gain. And so he continued to work tirelessly, building bridges and forging alliances wherever he could. He reached out to other community leaders, seeking to learn from their experiences and share his own hard-won wisdom. One day, as he was walking through the streets of the city, he came across a group of young people gathered on a street corner. They were laughing and joking with each other, their faces alive with joy and possibility. As Daniel drew closer, he realized that they were some of the same young people who had once been part of Razor's gang. But now, they were different. They stood tall and proud, their eyes clear and focused. One of them, a young woman named Maria, stepped forward to greet him. "Hey, Daniel," she said, her voice warm and confident. "We were just talking about you." Daniel raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "Oh? What about me?" Maria grinned, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "We were saying how we wouldn't be where we are today without you. How you showed us that we had the power to change our lives, to make a difference in the world." Daniel felt his heart swell with emotion. He had always known that this was about more than just him, that it was about empowering others to take control of their own destinies. But to hear it from Maria and the others, to see the impact he had made firsthand, was a powerful reminder of why he did what he did. "I'm just grateful to be a part of it," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "To see all of you standing here today, ready to take on the world, that's what it's all about." As he looked around at the faces of the young people gathered before him, Daniel knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But he also knew that together, they could achieve anything they set their minds to. As the city continued to flourish, Daniel found himself being sought out by people from all walks of life. Community leaders, business owners, even politicians came to him for advice and guidance, drawn by his reputation for wisdom and integrity. At first, Daniel was hesitant to take on such a public role. He had always seen himself as a behind-the-scenes player, someone who worked quietly to make things happen. But as he listened to the stories and struggles of those who came to him, he began to realize that he had a unique opportunity to make a real difference. And so he began to speak out more, using his platform to advocate for the issues that mattered most to him. He spoke about the importance of education and job training, about the need for affordable housing and healthcare. He called for greater investment in community programs and services, arguing that everyone deserved a chance to succeed, regardless of their background or circumstances. As his influence grew, so too did the challenges he faced. There were those who resisted change, who saw his efforts as a threat to their own power and privilege. There were others who sought to co-opt his message for their own gain, twisting his words and ideas to suit their own agendas. But through it all, Daniel remained true to his core values. He knew that the road to lasting change was never easy, that it required perseverance and sacrifice. But he also knew that it was a road worth traveling, no matter how long or difficult the journey might be. One evening, as he was preparing to give a speech at a community event, Daniel found himself reflecting on all that had happened since that fateful day when Razor's gang had first crossed his path. He thought about the lives that had been changed, the friendships that had been forged, the hope that had been rekindled in the hearts of so many. And as he stepped out onto the stage, he felt a sense of clarity and purpose wash over him. He knew that this was his calling, his chance to make a real and lasting difference in the world. And he was ready to embrace it with everything he had. As Daniel continued his work, he began to notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the city. It was as if a weight had been lifted, a sense of possibility and potential that had once seemed out of reach. People were coming together in ways they never had before, working side by side to build a better future for themselves and their children. They were starting businesses, volunteering in their communities, and taking an active role in shaping the direction of their city. And at the center of it all was the community center, a beacon of hope and possibility that had become the heart and soul of the city. It was a place where people could come to learn, to grow, to connect with others who shared their dreams and aspirations. As Daniel walked through the halls of the center one day, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. He had set out to make a difference, to prove that there was more to life than fear and intimidation. And now, seeing the smiling faces and bustling activity all around him, he knew that he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But even as he celebrated his victories, Daniel knew that there was still much work to be done. The city had come a long way, but there were still challenges to be faced, obstacles to be overcome. There were still those who sought to sow division and discord, who saw the progress that had been made as a threat to their own power and influence. And so Daniel redoubled his efforts, working tirelessly to build bridges and forge alliances wherever he could. He reached out to other cities and communities, sharing his experiences and learning from theirs. He continued to speak out on the issues that mattered most, never wavering in his commitment to justice and equality. And through it all, he held fast to the belief that had guided him from the very beginning, that every person, no matter their background or circumstances, had the power to change their lives and the world around them. It was a belief that had sustained him through the darkest of times, and one that would continue to inspire him for years to come. Years passed, and the city continued to thrive under the leadership of Daniel and the many others who had taken up the mantle of change. The community center had become a model for other cities and towns, a shining example of what was possible when people came together in the spirit of cooperation and compassion. But even as he celebrated the many successes and triumphs of his work, Daniel knew that his journey was far from over. There would always be new challenges to face, new obstacles to overcome. And he was ready to meet them head-on, armed with the knowledge and experience he had gained over the years. One day, as he was walking through the streets of the city, Daniel came across a group of young people gathered on a street corner. They were laughing and joking with each other, their faces alive with the same sense of joy and possibility that he had seen in Maria and the others all those years ago. As he drew closer, one of the young people turned to him, a curious expression on their face. "Hey mister," they said, their voice filled with a mix of excitement and trepidation. "Are you Daniel? The one who started the community center?" Daniel smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. "That's me," he said softly, his voice filled with warmth and compassion. "What's your name?" The young person introduced themselves, and soon the whole group was gathered around Daniel, peppering him with questions and stories of their own. They spoke of their dreams and aspirations, of the challenges they faced and the obstacles they had overcome. And as he listened to their words, Daniel felt a sense of hope and renewal wash over him. He knew that the work he had started all those years ago was far from finished, that there would always be more to do. But he also knew that he was not alone, that there were others who shared his vision and his passion for change. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose and determination, Daniel set out once again, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He knew that the road would not be easy, but he also knew that it was a road worth traveling, no matter where it might lead. For in the end, he knew that this was what mattered most: the connections they had forged, the lives they had touched, the hope they had inspired in the hearts of so many. It was a legacy that would endure long after he was gone, a testament to the power of community and the enduring strength of the human spirit.